Good evening and welcome to our show, Brookfield Public Advocate. I'm your host, Bruce Senig. Before we get to tonight's topic, I'd like to tell you about some of the programs we'll be working on for this year. We'll be doing a review show on some of the issues originating from Town Hall. We'll have guest hosts, and we'll continue our Meet the Candidate series with candidates for local boards up for election in the fall. Tonight's show deals with one of our country's most historic figures. With a highly acclaimed movie, and I believe it has 12 Oscar nominations, which is now in theaters, a best-selling book by Bill O'Reilly, a coin first minted on the anniversary of his 100th birthday, a luxury car named after him. Okay, I'm not so sure about that one. Our 16th president is one who today is regarded by many as the greatest president this country has ever had. We'll be talking with Brookfield's own Paula Hopewell, a Lincoln lecturer, much in demand these days. And for those of you who vote at the high school in Brookfield, to me, she's the face of the election workers who tirelessly man the polls. Maybe that in itself could be a show someday. Paula, welcome to Brookfield Public Advocate, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Bruce.
Please tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I was born and raised in northern Kentucky, which some of you may know is a border state. I was born on the south side of the Mason-Dixon line. I spent most of my life there, but I've moved around the country. I've lived in 6 states, most recently Connecticut. I've been here about 15 years.
Okay. Paula, tell our viewers when and how you developed such a passion for our 16th president. Of course, I learned about Abraham Lincoln in middle school, at least I believe it was. It could have been a little earlier. But frankly, I can't say that there was a great deal or an overwhelming amount of time spent on our 16th president, dedicated to him. Was that the case with you?
I think so, but I do have a very clear memory of being a child in elementary school, maybe about 3rd or 4th grade. And because we were in Kentucky, we learned that both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, were born in Kentucky. They were born about 100 miles apart from each other and within 1 year. So that fact stayed in my mind. I was certainly very much aware of the importance of my hometown area to the Civil War and the events that occurred at that time.
Yeah. Was being born in Kentucky, was that how you originally got interested in Abraham Lincoln, or were there some other?
Well, the incident I just mentioned was maybe a seed of interest, but the year that I turned 50, not all that long ago, I convinced my younger sister, Beth, to go with me on a tour of some sentimental spots in the state. And we went down to Bourbon Country in Kentucky, which happens to be where Abraham Lincoln was born and had his boyhood home. So that kind of triggered a greater interest in me. Shortly thereafter, the book A Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin, which is the basis for the Spielberg movie Lincoln. That book was published and enormously popular, and I was very impressed with it. And finally, in January of 2010, there was a program in New York City at the Historical Society, a full-day program about the Emancipation Proclamation. And I was able to attend that, and I didn't really know what to expect, but it turns out there were about 100 people there, as I recall. And some of the leaders of that program recommended that I might join a group called the Lincoln Forum that meets annually in Gettysburg. So I was really off and running by then.
Wow, okay. Can we put up for our viewers the border state map as the country looked back in the 1850s and 60s? Here you can see how the nation was divided from the period of the Civil War. And can we bring up another shot with the Kentucky in the Civil War? Oh, not us. There we go. Okay. As a refresher, let's briefly review what's most known about him, things well known about him. Can you put up the Lincoln Brady portrait slide, please? And Paula, if you can talk to that.
Yeah, I think the most well-known facts about Abraham Lincoln, first of all, his birth in a very spare log cabin in Kentucky. He spent most of his adult life in Illinois, which now, of course, claims that they are the land of Lincoln. He was the first Republican president that we had. He also issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which led to the abolishment of slavery. And his speeches are very famous. Probably the most famous one is the Gettysburg Address, 272 words of pure eloquence. And my personal favorite is his second inaugural address. So I think those are just a handful of things that most people know about him.
Yeah, I know when I first learned about him in history class, of course, was the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And I think it's kind of interesting that although he lost the election, he, of course, went on to become our president and seemed to, I don't know, whatever happened to Stephen Douglas? He
Well,
served in the
that's a
Senate
good question. I'm not quite sure I know.
But could you also tell our viewers some information about Lincoln that they might be surprised to learn?
Yes, Abraham and Mary Lincoln had a total of 4 sons. 2 of them died quite young at the ages of 3 and 11. A third son died when he was only 18, so there was really only one of the 4 sons who lived to adulthood and had children of his own. However, there are no living Lincoln descendants at this time. So the Emancipation Proclamation most people are aware of, but many people don't know that it was really a very restrictive, legalistic document, and Lincoln really used his powers as a commander-in-chief to free the slaves only in Confederate territory that was controlled by the Union. So there were slaves in the states called border states, my own Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri. There were slaves, they were northern states, but they were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln was a teetotaler. Even though he's from Bourbon country, he was a teetotaler. He did not want his brain addled in any way at any time. And he was the president who declared Thanksgiving to be a national holiday. Prior to that time, various regions and states celebrated Thanksgiving in their own time and way. And finally, he purportedly was the first president to issue a pardon of Jack the Turkey, his son's pet.
I think we have a couple of interesting slides, if we could put them up, regarding the slave market and the slave auction. Can we just put those up on the screen? This is an actual slide. I don't know if you have some comments that you could give our audience regarding these 2 slides.
Well, we're just trying to graphically portray, and I think the fact that this is a storefront advertising the sale of slaves as if you're going in to buy shoes or candy or something. I think it's a powerful image to remind us what a terrible institution that was.
If we could bring up the next slide.
And this is a picture of an actual slave auction. When Lincoln was a young man of about 19, he took a riverboat trip down to New Orleans, and he personally witnessed an event such as that.
So one can only imagine what was going through his mind when he witnessed that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Paul, I know that you've made presentations. You are a Lincoln lecturer. If you could please share with our audience some of the key points that you make about him.
Mm-hmm.
We could put some of the slides up on the screen.
Yeah, if you have the slide, man of compassion, to me that is the one big character trait of Abraham Lincoln that I admire the most. He had a very gentle nature, and I believe that the source of this enormous compassion was the many, many personal struggles he had to overcome in his life, and also many tragedies, personal tragedies that he suffered starting as a very young boy. He also spent almost his entire life in the border area of our country, so he was born and spent his earliest days in the upper south of Kentucky. His family moved into Indiana, the southern part of Indiana, and then on into Illinois, but those states were also very heavily influenced by the South, so he came into personal contact at a young age with all the controversies surrounding slavery and whether or not it should be allowed to exist or even to expand. Lincoln was very ambitious, again, from an early age. He was brilliant, he was energetic, he was a shrewd politician. His writing I admire very much. Several years ago, I read a book called Lincoln's Sword, and it was about his writing and how he used it almost as a weapon. His writing is just exquisite, it's poetic, it's extremely logical, powerful, persuasive. I just can't say enough about it. I mentioned before that my favorite piece of his writing is the second inaugural address, which I believe is a national prayer of reconciliation. He delivered this address shortly before the war was over. He spoke to the fact that both sides pray to the same God, read the same Bible. God knows why the Civil War was conducted, what a terrible tragedy it was. The losses were just horrific. And he attempted in that speech to lay the ground for bringing our country back together into one. And finally, something I really enjoy about Abraham Lincoln is his great love of telling jokes and stories. It was really a balm for his soul.
Yeah.
And
I think if we could put up one of the cartoons that you've chosen.
Okay. This just demonstrates him telling a little story. And one of my favorite jokes about him is someone apparently once accused him of being two-faced. And Lincoln's reply was, well, if I were two-faced, would I be wearing this one? He knew he was not a very attractive looking man, and he just was very self-deprecating in his humor.
Yeah. Well, in preparing for today's show, you forwarded to me some of the slides that you do with your presentations. And if we can put up the second inaugural shot, and that's a poor choice of words, but the from his second inaugural, and it shows John Wilkes Booth. I don't know in terms of distance, but it's probably no more than 50 yards from where Lincoln was giving the speech for his address. And we have circled in red where John Wilkes Booth was located, and you can see down towards the bottom of the picture Lincoln giving his address. I wouldn't say there was a whole lot of security back then.
No, no.
So this just, when I saw this, gave me goosebumps. It was just unbelievable to see that. Now, you've learned some interesting things about Brookfield's role in the Civil War. I think some of our viewers would be very surprised to learn about, and especially in his re-election bid in 1864. Can you share with our audience a little bit of that? And if we can bring up the slide with the flag that's actually located in the Historical Society here in Brookfield.
Yes, this flag was recently restored and hung at our Historical Society. It's a Copperhead flag, and the Copperheads were a group of peace Democrats, or they had a tendency to possibly favor the Southern point of view during the war. And this flag actually flew in Brookfield. Down the street there was a Northern Republican flag, and the groups of the two factions within town pretty much feuded during the war over whether or not it should continue. There were some skirmishes in this part of Connecticut. After the first Battle of Bull Run over in New Fairfield, some soldiers had come back from the Battle of Bull Run, and they found out there was a peace flag flying up in New Fairfield on a farm, and they went up there, and there was more or less a drunken brawl involving pitchforks and shovels and things like that. So this part of the country did have economic ties to the south, as did New York City. And while all the local towns supported Abraham Lincoln when he was elected president in 1860, by 1864, he ran against George McClellan, and many area towns did vote against Abraham Lincoln. I'm not sure if we can read the exact numbers there, but not only did our Brookfield vote against Lincoln for McClellan, but also New Fairfield, Newtown, the town of Washington, and by the widest margin of all, the town of Bridgewater voted for McClellan over Lincoln. So
yeah, when I look at that, what strikes me is in 1860, there were 4 candidates, I guess, then running.
yes.
And it's interesting to see, for example, on the Bethel line, we have 1/3. Now, preparing for this, I think you had mentioned that, was there a way actually to vote for literally none of the above?
I believe so. I never really got a definitive answer on that, but there was a kind of ballot called a fusion ticket, I believe. And as I understand it, the essence of that would be, I want anybody but Lincoln. Now, Lincoln does not have any fractional votes anywhere on the table. It's interesting to me also, and again, I can't see the precise numbers, but Breckinridge and Douglas were both Democratic candidates. The Democratic Party had a split. Both Democratic candidates were in favor of maintaining slavery, the difference between them being that the Southern Democrats, John Breckinridge, another Kentuckian, actually favored the expansion of slavery into the territories, where the Northern Democrats, they were also called Slavocrats, they wanted to maintain slavery, but they wanted it to be up to a local vote or local decision as to whether new territories would accept slavery or not.
Yeah.
And the John Bell, the other party, was just a hodgepodge of various people who didn't want to affiliate with any of the other 3 major parties.
Yeah. And was there even the Know Nothing Party? Was that?
The Know Nothing Party existed at that time. They didn't have a presidential candidate, and I'm a little bit shaky on the precise history, but one thing I do know is that their party platform was they were against immigrants, particularly German and Irish Catholic immigrants. That was their party platform.
Yeah. Now,
It's kind of shocking to our ears today, but it's true.
when you recently went to Gettysburg, I understand, to attend the Lincoln Forum and heard Steven Spielberg discuss his new film, Lincoln, at the National Cemetery. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And if we can put up the shot of Jim Getty.
Yes, Jim Getty is a man who has spent most of his career portraying Abraham Lincoln both at Gettysburg and around the country. There are quite a few of these people who do this, as a matter of fact. But Steven Spielberg was the keynote speaker on November 19th. Every year on November 19th, it's the anniversary of the delivery of the Gettysburg Address, and there's a major presentation at the National Cemetery. So Doris Kearns Goodwin was there. She introduced Spielberg, and he explained to us that he's become rather obsessed with Lincoln as a result of the 10 years that this film was in the making. He explained the difference between a documentary, which his film Lincoln is not. His film is considered authentic, meaning the events that are portrayed are believable for the times, but they're not necessarily documented facts. He's an artist and not a historian, so he's able to take certain liberties. One thing, he did sponsor a viewing of the film for us several days before that, and there is one scene in the movie that disturbed me a little bit. I didn't really find it in character, what I think Lincoln's character would have been. There's a scene in which Lincoln is having an argument with his oldest son, Robert. Robert really wants to join the Northern Army, and his father doesn't want him to, mostly because his mother doesn't want him to. So as part of this argument, Lincoln loses his temper and is shown slapping Robert. So several members of us from the Lincoln Forum found that maybe not something that would have really happened. But again, is it possible? Yes.
Taking a little liberty with, you know.
So Steven Spielberg said that if he has withdrawal symptoms about Lincoln, all he has to do is put Daniel Day-Lewis on speed dial and call up and get a little refresher.
That's funny. At the top of the show, I did mention that you're much in demand, and I understand that you'll actually be making some local presentations. Would you want to tell the people about that?
Sure. I'm very pleased to have an engagement with the Newtown Historical Society, and that will be on Monday night, February 11th. It starts at 7:30, and it will be in the meeting room of the library, the Newtown Booth Library. I will also be speaking to the Danbury Men's Club and separately to the Danbury New Fairfield Women's Club in the next month or two.
Yeah. Well, if people are interested in contacting you to maybe make presentations, how can you be reached? Or would you want them to contact Brookfield Public Advocate and we could pass that along to you?
That would be just fine.
Okay.
I'd be pleased to do that.
Okay. And at the end of the show, I'll mention, as I always do, the address, the email address where you can send that. So we're going to wrap up the show right now. We're getting close to the end of time. Obviously, a great man, a great historical figure for the country. I don't know if there was one last thing you might want to leave with our viewers.
Let's see, two things. When I went to the Lincoln Forum, the Lincoln presenters are there reading certain famous speeches or examples of his writing, and the first speaker this year, oddly, started with a condolence letter that Lincoln had written to a young woman whose father had died in the war. And I don't remember it verbatim, but one of the lines is, "In this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all." And he goes on to explain to her that she will feel better in due time. And another quote I like of Lincoln's is, "Sometimes I found myself on my knees because there was nowhere else to go."
Wow. Okay. Well, Paula, thank you very much for appearing, and hopefully some of the viewers have learned a little bit more other than what they learned maybe like as I did in middle school. So we're going to wrap up the show right now. Again, thank you very much for appearing. Paula Hopewell, Lincoln lecturer and historian. I want to remind our viewers that our air dates are on Charter Channel 21, are on Mondays at 4:30 and Thursdays at 7. We also post segments up on YouTube, so you can find prior shows, or if you want to see a replay, well, you can certainly access them there. We'd love to hear from you, whether it be comments about this show or prior shows, people maybe you'd like to see, or topics you'd like to see done. And you can contact us at brookfieldpublicadvocate@yahoo.com. Again, thanks for watching and good night.